You wake up face down in mud. Not the good kind of mud, either. This isn't one of those spa experiences where you're being exfoliated with Dead Sea minerals while Enya hums softly in the background. This mud is medieval. It's thick, it's cold, and it definitely just wriggled. You open your eyes, which you instantly regret, because now your left cornea has a worm in it. You sit up. Slowly. Everything hurts. Your lower back feels like it's been used as a blacksmith's anvil, and your mouth is so dry it feels like your tongue is shrink-wrapped in sandpaper. Congratulations. It's 1183. You are in a medieval village, and you're incredibly thirsty. You stand up and look around. There's a cluster of wooden hovels, some thatched roofs, a dozen chickens making suspicious eye contact, and one very cranky-looking woman dumping a chamber pot into the street. It splashes near your boots, which are actually just pieces of leather twine holding together what appear to be two flattened raccoons. You don't scream. You want to, but the dehydration makes it come out as a hoarse gargling sound, like a goose being mugged. The villagers glance at you, then return to their business. Nobody cares. They're too busy trying not to die from dysentery or get arrested for stealing turnips. So before you lie back down and start slowly decaying in a ditch, take a second, just one moment, to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It lets me keep telling these bizarre, mildly traumatic bedtime stories. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Seriously, I love knowing who else is half asleep, wondering why their life has led to medieval water politics. It's oddly comforting. Back to the thirst. You spot a bucket in the distance, hanging from what looks like a well. Sweet, glorious water. You stumble toward it, parched and full of naive optimism. The well is in the center of the village, guarded like it's the crown jewels. There's an old man sitting beside it, holding a stick that probably used to be a sword. His expression is a mix of suspicion and constipation. As you approach, he spits at your feet, misses, then squints. "Where's your token?" he asks. You blink. "Token? Token," he says again, louder this time, as if shouting will make you smarter. "Your water token. Ain't no bucket for no stranger." It's at this moment you realize that, yes, people used to fight over water. A lot. Wells were the Starbucks, the nightclubs, and the war zones of medieval life. If someone controlled the well, they controlled survival. The people around it, the land, even gossip. If water was life, and it was, then wells were currency. And you, dear stranger, are bankrupt. So instead of sipping fresh spring water, you're now being chased off with a stick by a man who hasn't bathed since the Norman conquest. Your throat cracks as you cough and stumble back toward your mud pile. Let's take a moment now, while you're sitting in the shade of someone else's pigsty, to talk about why this was your fate. Why water, which today arrives magically through your sink like a gift from the plumbing gods, used to be something worth killing for. Literally. Welcome to the thrilling, crusty, underappreciated world of medieval water rights. Let's be clear, water in medieval Europe was not simply a resource. It was an obsession, a political tool, a sacred element, and a sometimes fatal social landmine that could lead to bloodshed over buckets. It wasn't just about staying hydrated. It was about status, power, survival, and whether your neighbor's sheep were allowed to slurp from the same stream as yours without divine permission. Water wasn't free in the way we pretend it is today. If you were lucky enough to live near a spring, your lord might decide it was his personal gift from God. And if he didn't build a fence around it and charge you rent to access it, then he was either shockingly generous or probably about to die of plague anyway. For everyone else, which, statistically speaking, includes you, given your current situation, water came from shared sources. Rivers, streams, puddles, or, if you were very lucky and lived in a settlement with Roman leftovers, a well. But even wells were loaded with drama. Who dug it? Who owned the land it was on? Who paid for its upkeep? And, perhaps most importantly, whose sheep peed in it last Tuesday? Entire legal systems were developed to manage this nonsense. In fact, in 13th century England, if someone poisoned a well, either intentionally or by being gross and careless, they could be executed. Why? Because you weren't just endangering one household. You were potentially wiping out an entire community's only access to drinkable water. Which brings us to our next delightful medieval reality. Water wasn't always clean. You probably think well water sounds charming, rustic, healthy, like it comes with a side of hand-churned butter. Nope. Well water was often brackish, muddy, warm, and full of invisible murder bacteria. No breed of filters here, friend. Just hope, luck, and maybe a prayer to Saint Hyginus, the patron saint of not dying horribly from intestinal worms. Also, that well might not actually belong to the town. It might be privately owned by a monastery. Yes, monasteries were not just sleepy little hubs of silent prayer and mildly passive-aggressive vows of chastity. They were also landlords and waterlords. They'd fence off a spring, declare it blessed, and then charge peasants for access, either in coin or in tithes or in the currency of medieval suffering, labor. You might spend 4 hours hauling stones just for the privilege of filling one bucket that smells faintly like frog. And don't even think about complaining. You'd be reminded very quickly that without this sacred water, your entire family could die of thirst, or worse, be forced to drink rainwater from your roof, which was full of soot, bird droppings, and that one weird neighbor who never left his attic. But let's zoom in on the communal village well, the beating heart of any medieval settlement. It was a place of ritual and chaos. Women, because yes, it was always women, gathered to fill jars, swap rumors, and occasionally accuse each other of witchcraft. Kids played nearby, unless they fell in and became a cautionary tale. And local officials, if the village had any, kept a close eye on who used too much water or whose goat got too close to the rope pulley. That was a punishable offense, by the way, goat interference. And if the well dried up, panic, absolute, mud-caked, hysteria. Because finding a new water source wasn't like opening Google Maps and tapping near a spring. You had to dig, by hand, hope you didn't strike salt, or gas, or nothing. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, clawing at earth while villagers whispered about bad omens and whether or not you'd anger the spirits. Because yes, people believed wells had spirits, often female, sometimes named, occasionally demanding sacrifices. Did this stop people from throwing trash into wells? No, not even slightly. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the full medieval hypocrisy. People would bless a well one week, then dump their leftover stew bones into it the next. Wells were simultaneously sacred and septic. Which is why, eventually, cities started building public fountains and aqueducts to carry cleaner water from springs outside city walls. But that caused new problems. Pipelines meant someone could tamper with your water before it got to you. You'd wake up, drink a cup, and boom, cholera. Meanwhile, in the countryside, people still fought over natural springs and rivers. Villagers would redirect streams by digging little ditches, called leats, to steal water from neighboring hamlets. This led to legal disputes, village brawls, and the occasional surprise beheading. And since literacy wasn't exactly widespread, these arguments were usually settled with fists, bribes, or public shaming via turnip pelting. The most dramatic example? Look no further than castle sieges. If a castle had a private well within its walls, it could withstand a siege for months. But if the water source was outside the castle, sorry, you were toast. Or, more accurately, parched toast. Thirsty defenders would try to sneak out at night to fill buckets, risking arrows and ambushes, all for a few pints of muddy water that smelled like despair. So yes, people fought over wells. They fought with their neighbors, with other towns, with animals, with God, with the concept of sanitation itself. And here you are, sitting in a muddy field, watching a goat urinate near the well you're not allowed to touch. The wind smells faintly of cabbage and hopelessness. You close your eyes, not because you're sleepy, but because this is somehow less exhausting than the endless, centuries-long game of who controls the bucket. It's now late afternoon in your charming medieval nightmare. The sun is lowering over the thatched rooftops like a slowly collapsing loaf of moldy bread. Chickens are heading home, or to wherever chickens go, when they're done making everyone else's lives miserable. The mud is dried slightly on your tunic, which, by the way, is made from something called homespun, which is just a fancy medieval word for itchy sackcloth that smells like disappointment. You still haven't had a drink. And the monk guarding the well? He's now asleep, slumped over his stick, drooling into the dust. But you don't dare try your luck. Not just because you're afraid of waking him up, but because at this point, you've learned something important. You don't mess with medieval water politics. Why? Because people, whole groups of people, were willing to die, kill, and occasionally burn each other's granaries to the ground over who got first dibs on a puddle. Let's talk about water wars. Not the dramatic kind you see in sci-fi movies, with giant tanks rolling across deserts and Tom Hardy yelling at someone in leather. No, these were quieter, pettier, somehow even more exhausting. These were medieval water disputes, bitter, long-lasting, and incredibly stupid-sounding until you remember that not having water is a quick path to death via kidney failure and hot, stinky breath. Take 12th century England. You might be thinking, misty fields, Robin Hood, everyone talking like they're in a BBC drama. No. Replace that with legal chaos and trench foot. Picture two manors, let's call them Wetworth and slightly Wetterton, separated by a creek. For generations, both villages used the creek to water their crops, bathe their babies, and sometimes dispose of unfortunate livestock. But one fateful spring, slightly Wetterton decides to build a makeshift dam. Just a little one. To keep more water flowing their way. It's nothing personal. Just survival. Naturally, Wetworth notices that their fields are now slightly more crunchy than fertile, and someone's sheep has started coughing in Morse code. So what happens next? First, an angry delegation. Half a dozen villagers from Wetworth walk the 5 miles to slightly Wetterton, each carrying a stick and at least one bad attitude. They accuse. They grumble. They wave their sticks in threatening but confusing patterns. Slightly Wetterton responds by doubling the dam size, because spite is stronger than community. Then comes the nighttime sabotage. Villagers from Wetworth sneak over under the cover of darkness, armed with nothing but their shovels and centuries of generational resentment. They tear down the dam. The creek flows freely. Victory. Until the next night, when slightly Wetterton retaliates by not only rebuilding the dam, but redirecting the entire creek into a hastily dug ditch that bypasses Wetworth completely and ends in a pond where they plan to raise ducks, because even in medieval times, petty revenge needed a mascot. Eventually, things escalate to violence. And not the glamorous sword-fighting kind. No, this is more like angry men in linen tunics, slapping each other with turnips and occasionally swinging rusty tools in a way that suggests more enthusiasm than skill. One man gets a dislocated shoulder. Another falls into the duck pond and refuses to come out, claiming it is now a holy site. At this point, the local lord gets involved. He rides in on a horse that's probably named something absurd like Clodstrider and demands that both villages stop behaving like unschooled fishwives. Which is ironic, because none of the fishwives have been to school, and they're arguably the only ones trying to keep things civilized. Anyway, a decision is made, a common usage agreement is drawn up, stating that both villages must share the creek and maintain it jointly, or pay fines. The agreement is written on parchment, read aloud in bad Latin, and promptly ignored by everyone involved. Welcome to feudal water diplomacy. Now let's travel a bit further, across the Channel, into southern France during the 13th century. A land of troubadours, castles, heretics, and yes, aqueduct sabotage. Here in the dry, rocky landscapes of Occitania, water was everything. Towns that had it flourished. Towns that didn't withered, or worse, relied on wine for hydration. Which sounds fun until you realize medieval wine was closer to vinegar and made you go blind if you drank it warm. In places like Montpellier and Nîmes, water systems built by the Romans still existed, but barely. Old stone aqueducts crumbled. Wells dried up. Springs changed course mysteriously, sometimes because of the devil, but more often because your neighbors had rerouted them using primitive hydraulics and aggressive denial. Cities hired engineers, real ones, with tools and knowledge and questionable hygiene, to track water flow and dig tunnels. Some cities even fought wars over the control of a single spring located outside their walls. Armies were sent. Siege weapons were used. And all to control a spout in a rock that dribbled enough water to fill 6 buckets an hour. It sounds ridiculous, but that was enough to sustain thousands if used wisely. Spoiler, it never was. And then there were the monks. Yes, the monks. Peaceful, pious, praying, chanting. Except when they were locking the gates to their spring houses and refusing to let local peasants drink unless they attended mass. And donated. And maybe gave up one of their chickens. Because who needs salvation when you can have leverage? Cistercian monasteries, especially, were notorious for building massive waterworks on their land. They constructed aqueducts, mills, and cisterns. They dammed rivers. They diverted streams. They made water go uphill. Sort of. These weren't just places of worship. They were hydraulic empires. And when disputes arose, oh, they didn't fight with swords. No, that would be unseemly. They sued. Endlessly. Monks would launch legal campaigns against nearby villages for water theft, which meant anything from using a shared stream without permission to letting your cow pee upstream. The documents from these trials still exist, and they are full of the kind of bureaucratic poetry only medieval clerics could produce. Let it be recorded, on the 8th day of Michaelmas, that Brother Geoffrey's sluice gate was interfered with by the pig herder of Languedoc, resulting in the defilement of the blessed cistern with suspicious turbidity. Translation: someone pooped in the monk pond again. But this wasn't just a rural problem. Urban centers had their own water turf wars. In 14th century London, for instance, clean water was piped in via lead conduits from nearby springs. These pipes were often tampered with by enterprising criminals, pipe tappers, who siphoned water illegally to brew beer, wash clothes, or just sell it in jugs to the incredibly gullible. City officials created a job called the Keeper of the Conduits, which sounds noble but basically meant chasing grown men through the alleys of Southwark for illegally slurping stolen stream water into barrels. The job paid terribly and involved frequent swamp foot. Sometimes, when people got especially desperate, they poisoned each other's wells. Not always on purpose. Sometimes it was just accidental corpse proximity, but intentional sabotage did happen. During the Black Death, rumors flew that wells had been deliberately infected by enemies, outsiders, or anyone who looked vaguely foreign and suspiciously hydrated. These accusations led to witch trials, lynchings, pogroms. So while you, in your modern blanket cocoon, might think of water as a relaxing, sleep aid background sound, in the Middle Ages, it was more like a liquid panic button. Someone steals your bucket, that's a beating. Someone blocks your stream, that's a brawl. Someone dumps their alchemy leftovers into your well, that's war. And speaking of war, let's go bigger. Because you might think of empires rising and falling because of gold, or territory, or religion. But often, the real fight was for control of water. The Crusades, for instance, weren't just about spiritual salvation. They were also about the ability to survive in an arid landscape. Castles in the Holy Land were built around cisterns. Springs were fought over like diamond mines. When Muslim forces besieged Christian fortresses, their first tactic was often to cut off water. Not arrows, not siege towers, just dehydration. Because nothing breaks morale faster than watching your last water barrel evaporate in the desert sun while Brother Thomas tries to hydrate with beef gravy. You shift on your filthy mat of straw, the evening air now full of the sounds of frogs, arguing peasants, and someone choking on a beet. You close your eyes. You imagine water. Clean water. Cold. Clear. Maybe from a tap. Maybe with ice cubes. Maybe with a little lemon wedge. But no. You're in 1183, remember? There is no plumbing. No lemon. No concept of filtered. There is only the well. And it is guarded. And it is suspect. But don't worry. We're just getting started. Next, we'll take a long, moldy stroll through the lives of the people most affected by all this aquatic drama. The water carriers, washerwomen, ditch diggers, and unfortunate souls whose entire lives revolved around keeping everyone else hydrated. So go ahead. Sink deeper into your itchy bedroll. The fight for water is far from over. Morning arrives like a slap with a cold cabbage. There's no sunrise, not in the romantic, birds chirping, inspirational Instagram quote way. No. The medieval sun just happens. One moment it's pitch black and you're drooling into a straw mat that smells like mildew and collective failure, and the next, the roof hole above you starts leaking light like some celestial landlord remembered to pay the candle bill. You stretch. Something cracks. Might be your spine. Might be a rat. Hard to tell. And you're already late. Because today, like every other day, your job is hauling water. Not for fun. Not for personal wellness. Not for your skincare regimen, which consists entirely of mud and regret. No, you carry water because you are one of the blessed few, or cursed many, whose entire existence revolves around the transportation of life juice from point A to point slightly less muddy. You are, in other words, a medieval water carrier. It's not glamorous. There are no tips, no uniforms, no prestige. But there is a wooden yoke across your shoulders, 2 leaky buckets, and a series of back spasms that would make a chiropractor weep. And the worst part? You do it all so someone else can have cleanish water for their lentil soup. Not that you ever get lentil soup. You mostly get broth. Sort of. Occasionally. So before you trudge out the door, and while you're still semi-conscious, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoyed this kind of half-historical, half-sleep-inducing suffering. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always bizarrely wonderful to know who else is lying in the dark listening to 800-year-old water disputes instead of sleeping like a normal person. Anyway, the village is stirring. By stirring, I mean someone is yelling about chickens. Again. A baby is crying. The blacksmith's apprentice is already shirtless and sweaty for no reason other than to establish dominance. And the baker's wife is screaming at a goat, which, to be fair, has probably earned it. You shoulder your buckets and head to the well. It's a short walk, but also, somehow, the longest walk of your day. Because water is heavy. Really heavy. 1 gallon weighs over 8 pounds. And you're carrying several gallons. In uneven, wooden buckets that leak just enough to leave a damp trail of your humiliation through the entire village. Oh, and the handle gives you splinters. The well is already surrounded. You squeeze in between a grumpy widow and a girl who might be 12 or 35. Medieval aging is weird. And you wait. You wait a long time. Someone ahead of you is hogging the rope. Someone else is accusing someone of skipping the line. Tensions are high. It's barely sunrise and already someone's muttering about divine punishment and witches in the water. You get your turn. Finally, you drop the bucket, listening to it splash and echo as it descends into the darkness like a doomed dream. You haul it up, slowly, painfully, and then again, and again, until your arms feel like boiled reeds and your spine is writing passive-aggressive letters to your kneecaps. Then, the best part, you carry that water back across uneven, rocky paths, dodging pigs, small children, actual piles of feces, and at least one monk muttering about eternal thirst. This is your job. Every day. Rain or shine. Winter or plague. And if you don't do it, someone goes without water. Someone important. Like a merchant. Or the baker. Or the guy who thinks bathing once a month is an indulgence only nobles should afford. And you don't even get to use it yourself. Your own drinking water comes from the runoff bucket. The bucket no one else wants. The bucket with a little something floating in it. Might be a leaf. Might be a bug. Might be a part of a larger, unspoken mystery. Either way, you drink it. Because options are a luxury, and you live in a world where the town barber is also the dentist, surgeon, and therapist. But you're not alone in your watery burden. Oh no. There are washerwomen. Legends in linen. Women whose entire existence is defined by scrubbing, beating, and boiling fabrics stained with things that can only be described as medically inadvisable. These are the true heroines of the medieval laundry economy. They rise before dawn. They lug water from wells or rivers or ditches. They carry heavy baskets of clothing that smell like fermented peasant. They boil water over open flames, despite the very real risk of smoke inhalation, accidental boiling, or spontaneous combustion via despair. They beat clothes with paddles. Real paddles. Like literal sticks. On stones. In freezing water. Their hands go numb. Their backs give out. Their fingers crack. But still they wash. Because somewhere, someone's tunic has been stained by a regrettable stew incident, and dignity must be restored. You might think this earns them respect. It does not. Washerwomen were often seen as gossip-mongers, temptresses, or suspiciously independent for people who touch your underwear. They were tolerated, feared, and underpaid, mostly paid in leftover bread or favors or promises that were never fulfilled. Like, next time, I won't forget to tip you. They always did. And if they didn't work fast enough, their customers went back to wearing the same shirt for 11 days straight. Which sounds gross. And was. But also normal. Because in the Middle Ages, hygiene was more of a suggestion than a standard. Most people owned exactly one set of clothes. Maybe two if they were rich or had stolen a tunic from a dying uncle. If you're imagining everyone walking around in filth and smelling like smoked goat, correct. That's exactly what it was like. But let's not forget the ditch diggers. unsung heroes of unpleasant infrastructure. These poor souls were responsible for digging and maintaining the channels that brought water from natural sources into towns and manors. We're not talking clean, flowing canals here. We're talking narrow, mosquito-infested, mud-caked trenches that regularly collapsed and occasionally revealed horrifying surprises, like skeletons, ancient garbage, or disgruntled badgers. Ditch digging wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean. It wasn't appreciated. But without it, water didn't flow. Mills didn't grind. Crops didn't grow. And the entire ecosystem of misery fell apart. The pay? Terrible. The perks? Back pain, foot rot, and maybe, if you were lucky, a crust of bread wrapped in someone else's cloth napkin. Still not impressed? Let's talk about well sweepers. Yes, that was a job. People were paid, sometimes, to go down into wells with a rope, a torch, and a vague hope of surviving, in order to clean out whatever had died, fallen, or festered inside. This might include frogs, mold, bones, shoes, hats, religious guilt, and occasionally an entire goat that thought it could fly. The stench? Imagine a stew made of wet socks, expired pickles, and moral decay. The air was so foul that some well sweepers passed out halfway down, leading to the creation of a secondary job, well haulers, whose job was to pull out the unconscious guy with a hook. If this seems absurd, it's because it was. But it also worked. For a while. Sort of. Until the next drought. Or the next flood. Or the next neighbor who decided to urinate suspiciously close to the water source. Because that's the thing about water in the Middle Ages. You could work your entire life trying to manage it, clean it, carry it, or even worship it, and still die from drinking it. Statistically, that's exactly how a lot of people went out. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, unnamed illnesses with symptoms like sudden bubbling death and liquefied soul syndrome. Water was life, and death, and occasionally lunch if you drank it with enough barley and called it soup. You, meanwhile, finally finish your morning route. Your shoulders are sore. Your feet are blistered. You've been yelled at twice and flirted with once by someone who might have been serious or just had bad depth perception. You head home. Your tiny, smoky, damp home. And you drop the buckets. One of them cracks. Of course it does. You sigh. Deeply. Existentially. Tomorrow, you'll have to fix it with pitch. Or string. Or hope. But tonight, you rest. On your straw mat. Surrounded by the sounds of dripping, croaking, and someone outside arguing with a duck. You drift to sleep with one final thought. At least you didn't fall into the well. Not yet, anyway. You wake up in a four-poster bed. Yes, a bed. Not a haystack. Not a cold dirt floor. Not a pile of old turnip sacks under a pig cart. A legitimate, wooden-framed, linen-draped, actual bed. Because in this chapter, you're no longer a humble peasant. You are noble. Sort of. You're not royalty. Don't get carried away. But you've got a title. A little land. Maybe a crumbling stone house with actual windows. A servant who hates you. A wife who pines for someone from court. You know, all the basics of upper-class medieval life. Your mattress smells like damp wool and centuries of unresolved trauma. But compared to everyone else in your manor, you're practically spaliving. You sit up slowly, groaning like a haunted wardrobe. Your nightshirt is scratchy. Your chamber pot is full. Your teeth hurt. Possibly from existing. Possibly from the honey-drenched bread you gnawed on before falling asleep last night. Dessert fit for a medieval minor noble. Because sugar is status and you're not above flexing your decaying molars. Today, however, you are thinking about water. Or, more specifically, how you plan to avoid touching it. Because bathing, my lord, is for the committed, or the French. And you, like many of your English-speaking neighbors, have developed a complex spiritual and social system to justify not using water unless absolutely necessary. See, water isn't just wet in your world. It's suspicious. It's risky. It opens your skin to bad humors. It carries disease. And worst of all, it's cold. You'd rather die than bathe in cold water. And statistically, you might. But before we slide into that sweaty pit of irony, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you somehow found joy in listening to a man whisper sarcastically about hygiene crimes. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you in a warm bed or in a puddle of medieval existential dread? Either way, I hope you're comfy. So, water. You don't fetch it, of course. Please. That's for peasants. You've got a servant to do that. Or 3. Maybe a page boy who's already lost half his childhood to running jugs from the manor cistern up 3 flights of drafty stairs. They fill your basin, a polished pewter one, naturally, with water pulled from a well that's allegedly filtered through gravel and hope. You splash your face. Lightly. No rubbing. No scrubbing. Just a ceremonial flick, like you're baptizing your forehead with a teaspoon of regret. For your hair, there's a comb. For your breath, there's wine. For your hands, a little scented vinegar. That's your version of clean. If you want to get real wild, you might change your shirt. Maybe. Bathing, a full body, intentional soak, is a thing. A rare thing. A twice-a-year sort of thing. Or a someone important is visiting thing. Or a you're being married off to a French widow with a castle thing. Certainly not an everyday routine. You'd bathe more often, of course, if it weren't for the risks. Like drafts. Or death. Or a sudden awareness of how bad everything smells. But when you do bathe, oh, it's an event. A wooden tub. Possibly lined with linen. Water warmed in giant iron pots over fire. Poured in by servants, bucket after bucket, until the temperature is somewhere between lukewarm tea and boiled peasant stew. Then you disrobe, slowly, dramatically, like a depressed ghost, and slide in. The water turns gray almost immediately. No one mentions it. Instead, someone might pour a little rosemary oil into the bath. Maybe rosewater. Lavender if you're really showing off. You lean back, stare at the ceiling, and briefly fantasize about fleeing to a monastery just so you don't have to marry that French widow with the castle. Afterward, you dry off with a cloth that's been used by no fewer than 6 other people in the house. It's crunchy. You ignore it. And your clothes? Rarely washed. Well, doesn't like soap. Linen is expensive to launder. And you're afraid your best tunic might shrink into a moral scandal if soaked. So instead of washing your clothes, you just perfume them. That's right. You sprinkle herbs, oils, or even dried flowers into your sleeves and collars to give off the illusion of cleanliness. Like medieval Febreze. If Febreze also gave you hives and occasionally caught fire near candles. Some nobles go a step further and fill little pouches with spices or dried citrus, then hang them from their belts like fashionably pungent grenades. But here's the twist, even though you're rich, you still share your bathwater. That's right. You go first. Obviously. But then the rest of the household takes their turn. Your spies, your children, possibly your steward, maybe your in-laws if they're visiting. 1 tub. 1 bucketful of stewed filth. 5 to 10 very confused participants. This is where the saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," allegedly comes from. Because after the whole family had marinated in the same water, the liquid turned so murky that the baby, last to bathe, of course, was practically invisible at the bottom. A metaphor. And a hygiene horror story. And yes, this is still considered luxurious. Because most people never bathe. Not really. Not unless it rains and they trip. Now, if you're thinking, wait, weren't public bathhouses a thing in the Middle Ages? You're absolutely correct. For a while, they were thriving. Bathhouses were common in many medieval towns, particularly in places influenced by Roman traditions. People paid to soak in hot baths, often with separate chambers for different classes or genders. Some bathhouses offered food and music. Others offered companionship. You know, the kind that isn't exactly endorsed by the church. Which is why, by the 14th century, bathhouses began to acquire a bit of a reputation. 1 part hygiene, 1 part syphilis. Clergy started warning against them. Cities began regulating or shutting them down. Public baths became less about cleanliness and more about scandal. And then came the plagues, which convinced everyone that maybe it wasn't the best idea to sit in warm, communal broth with 30 strangers and a dead rat. And so, nobles returned to their private, solitary, twice-a-year baths. Water use declined. Perfume use skyrocketed. And the world's collective body odor reached a new historical high. But don't worry. You can still clean your soul. The church offers spiritual hygiene, confession, penance, prayer. Much safer than warm water. In fact, many nobles believed that bathing too often weakened the body and made it vulnerable to sin, because a clean body might lead to sinful thoughts. Or worse, French ideas about regular hygiene. So you go to Massachusetts. You light a candle. You donate some silver. You smell like you've been roasting sheep in a summer barn. But it's fine, because inside, you're clean. Back at the manor, your steward informs you that the water cistern needs cleaning. You nod, politely, as if you have any intention of dealing with it. That's a servant's job. A terrifying servant who will descend into the slime-filled tank with a hook and a prayer and come back 2 shades paler and full of stories about dead squirrels and lost spoons. Water for drinking? It's boiled, if you're smart, or at least heated slightly. But most of the time, it's mixed with ale or wine to make it less disgusting. Even children drink watered-down alcohol. Because regular water might kill you, but fermented water just makes you sleepy. Which is, coincidentally, what you're feeling right now. The fire is crackling. You're wrapped in 3 layers of wool and pride. A faint scent of rosewater hovers in the air, or maybe that's mildew. Your servants are carrying buckets up and down the stairs like anxious turtles. You sigh. You've done nothing all day but avoid responsibility and accidentally sponsor historical decline. Being noble is exhausting. You close your eyes. You dream of clear springs and warm rivers and clean sheets and a toothbrush. But when you wake up, it'll still be the 1300s, and you'll still smell like privilege and goat. You wake up to shouting. It's not dramatic shouting. No one is being murdered. Not yet. It's more like the angry, echoing rhythm of neighbors who've had just enough sleep to be dangerous and just little enough to fight at sunrise over a trickle of muddy water. You shuffle out of your lumpy straw bed and poke your head out of your hut, or rather, what barely passes as a hut. It's mostly wattle, a little daub, and a whole lot of weather damage. You squint into the morning fog, and there they are, 2 grown men arguing with the passion of drunken poets and the vocabulary of angry goats. Why? Because someone redirected the water trough. Again. In the world of medieval Europe, you don't need money or land or a title to start a blood feud. You just need a shared well, a cracked wooden pipe, and a firm belief that your neighbor is a demon sent to ruin your cabbage patch. Welcome to the great water conflicts, not the grand sieges or massive invasions, but the everyday petty, passive-aggressive, hilltop village rivalries that caused more fistfights than famine. Because in the Middle Ages, owning water didn't just mean you got to drink. It meant you controlled everything. Crops, livestock, industry, your neighbor's sanity. So before we dive face first into the shallow puddle of medieval aquatic politics, do me a small favor. Like the video. Subscribe if you enjoyed drifting to sleep while learning about historical nonsense, and let me know in the comments what time it is for you and what corner of the world you're from. Because somehow, we've built a weird global village of tired people listening to medieval misery, and that's kind of beautiful. Anyway, back to the water fight. See, in a medieval village, water isn't a public utility. There's no Department of Irrigation. No neighborhood notice board explaining who gets the stream on Thursdays. It's a free-for-all. Or more accurately, it's only free if you're willing to fight your cousin's cousin over an ankle-deep ditch. Let's imagine you live in a small village in 13th century England. There's a single well, hand-dug, possibly by the ancestors of a local drunk. It's 20 feet deep, lined with slippery stone, and maintained by a man named Osric who's mostly blind and thinks ghosts live at the bottom. This is your water source. Unless it dries up, in which case, your second option is the stream at the edge of town, which technically runs through Lord Farnham's lands. Which means technically you need permission. Which means actually you're just going to sneak a bucket at dawn and hope no one sees you. Too late. You've been spotted by Farnham's Reeve. A man with a stick, a hatred of peasants, and the uncanny ability to appear whenever someone's trying to steal water, firewood, or dignity. He finds you 1 penny. You don't have one. So he takes your duck. That was your only duck. And now you're mad. So you wait a few days. Pretend to behave. Then you and your neighbor sneak out at night and redirect the stream with some logs, some dirt, and several illegal hopes. You channel it just slightly toward your barley field. You don't technically steal anything. You just encourage the water to reconsider its path in life. Lord Farnham finds out 3 days later when his garden dies and his bath smells like sadness. He sends men with spades. They destroy your canal. You cry. He cries. Someone punches a pig out of frustration. This is normal. This is every village. Because without water rights, you're at the mercy of geography and the most stubborn man in town. And unfortunately, that's usually you. In France, it's worse. In rural Aquitaine, families literally record water usage in family ledgers. You inherit a house, a field, a cow, and the right to pull 4 buckets of water from the local spring every Tuesday. If someone takes water on your day, you can fine them, or duel them, or write an angry poem about their selfishness and recite it at a tavern until someone throws stale bread at you. Sometimes, these water disputes go to court, which sounds civilized. It is not. In many towns, the local manor court handles these things, the same court that deals with pig theft, infidelity, and complaints about loud roosters. You stand before the reeve, a jury of angry villagers, and someone named Giles who once fell in the well and now has opinions about everything. You explain, calmly, that your neighbor's new sheep washing ditch is clearly rerouting the communal stream away from your cabbages. He argues that your cabbages were already cursed and possibly undead. Someone throws mud. Court is dismissed. Welcome to justice. And don't even get me started on the monks. Monasteries love water. Not just for drinking. For power. Monks build mills. Monks need streams. And when monks want water, they get water, even if it means diverting half the river through their herb garden and leaving the villagers downstream with nothing but wet pebbles and bitterness. In the 12th century, Cistercian monks became notorious for this. They'd show up in a valley, build a glorious, self-sustaining monastery, with Roman-style drainage and aqueducts and cloisters and fish ponds, and then quietly redirect every single waterway in a 5-mile radius so that their cheese stayed cold and their trout stayed plump. And when the villagers protested, the monks would respond with something along the lines of, "God gave us dominion over this stream. Sorry, it's in Latin, you wouldn't understand." Petitions were written. Letters were sent. At least one angry villager walked 40 miles to complain to the bishop about excessive ecclesiastical splashing. He was sent home with a sermon and a single tunic. In Italy, things got legal. Water rights became part of land titles. If you sold a field, you had to specify how much stream access came with it. 1 meter? 10 buckets? Seasonal trickle? If you lied about it, you could be sued. Which, in medieval legal tradition, meant you stood in front of a notary while 2 angry farmers tried to outshout each other and occasionally demonstrated their points using sticks. Sometimes, cities fought each other. In Spain and the Middle East, where irrigation was everything, entire cities went to war over water channels. In Muslim Spain, intricate irrigation systems were regulated by water courts, yes, actual water courts, where judges would determine, down to the hour, when each person got their flow. If someone cheated, they got fined, or their canal got bricked up. Or in some cases, a friendly mob would appear with torches and help redistribute the water by force. No one is above a good torchlight negotiation. And it's not just humans. In some regions, animals cause water disputes. If your livestock wandered to the communal spring and muddied it up, your neighbor could demand compensation, either in the form of coin, grain, or, in one recorded case, public apology by standing in the stream with a sign that said, "My goat is a criminal." You think I'm joking. I'm not. And through it all, the same truth remained. If you wanted to survive, you needed water. But if you wanted to control people, you needed to control the water. And so you did. You built fences, dug canals, blocked access, held grudges, drew maps with little blue lines on them, and told your great-grandchildren never to trust the Miller's family because they once stole a bucketful during the drought of 98. Not 1998. 1298. It's passed down like treasure. And so, you sit now in your doorway watching your neighbors bicker over a hole in the ground with a bit of damp at the bottom. You sip your barley beer. You think about blocking the stream again, just for fun. Because nothing in this village is more valuable than the ability to say, "That puddle, it's mine." You wake up and something's off. There's a chill in the air. Not the usual kind that says your hut has no insulation and the door is held shut with a stick. No, this chill is weird. Like the kind of cold that seeps under your skin and whispers, "Don't go near the old well today." You know the one. It's at the edge of the forest. Sunken, covered in moss, with a crooked wooden lid that no one dares touch anymore. The villagers say it's cursed, or haunted, or sacred, depending on who you ask and how drunk they are. Welcome to the world of supernatural water. Because back then, water wasn't just a resource. It was a presence, a force, sometimes a god, sometimes a ghost, occasionally a really passive-aggressive fairy who would drown you for looking at her wrong. Let's start with the obvious, holy wells. All over medieval Europe, especially in Celtic regions like Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, wells weren't just wells. They were places of power. You didn't just drink from them. You prayed at them. You tied ribbons to nearby trees. You whispered wishes into the water and hoped it didn't whisper back. These wells were often Christianized, meaning someone came along, tossed in a crucifix, renamed it after a saint, and pretended it had never been pagan at all. This was a common medieval move. Pagan spring? Boom. Now it's St. Winifred's well. Did villagers used to toss offerings to water nymphs? Don't worry. Now they're tossing rosaries. Progress. Some wells were associated with miracles. Like actual, church-certified miracles. Healing blindness. Curing gout. Making your cows less stupid. That kind of thing. Pilgrims would travel for miles to touch the water, fill a jug, or just cry into the mud, while praying to a dismembered saint who once lived in a cave. St. Winifred's Well in Wales is probably the most famous example. According to legend, Winifred was beheaded by a creepy man for refusing to marry him. Her head rolled downhill. A spring burst from the earth where it landed. Naturally, someone built a shrine over it and declared the water holy. Because nothing says sacred like decapitation and groundwater. People bathed in it, drank it, collected it in bottles to bring home, like medieval Gatorade. One man claimed it healed his leg. Another claimed it cured his daughter's demon. Whether it actually worked is unclear, but what's certain is that thousands believed it. Some still do. And if you think that's wild, wait until we get to the cursing wells. Yes, cursing. Because for every holy well, there was another one where the locals said you could leave a curse. Usually by throwing in a bent coin, a dead bird, or, in more dramatic cases, a written prayer involving phrases like "May his crops fail and his sheep explode." These weren't isolated superstitions. These were known, repeated, and feared. In Ireland, one such well involved turning a stone widdershins, that's counterclockwise, in case you weren't raised by druids, while muttering the name of the person you wanted to afflict. Then you'd throw a coin in the water, spit over your shoulder, and run away. Fast. Did it work? Probably not. But if the person did fall ill, you got to say, "Well, shouldn't have laughed at my tunic, Aiden." Then there were the well spirits. Europe has a long and deeply uncomfortable history with water creatures. Not the Disney kind. The terrifying kind. Like nixies, kelpies, and rizalki, beautiful female spirits who lived in ponds and rivers and enjoyed drowning overly curious men. Take the nixie. This is a Germanic water spirit, often appearing as a beautiful maiden sitting near a stream, brushing her hair. Sounds romantic? It's not. Because if you approach, she pulls you into the water and drowns you with the tenderness of a soggy boot. Sometimes she sings. Sometimes she plays a harp. Sometimes she just stares at you silently until your soul pees itself. Rizalki are worse. These Slavic spirits are the ghosts of drowned women. They're pale, wet, and extremely annoyed. They haunt rivers, especially at night, and if you're a wandering man with poor judgment, you might hear one laughing and think, "Hey, I should investigate that." You shouldn't. And kelpies? Scottish legends say they're shape-shifting horse demons. They look like regular horses, standing by a lock. Until you climb on their back. Then their skin becomes adhesive, they gallop into the water, and you become kelpie food. Moral of the story? Never trust a wet horse in Scotland. But it wasn't just pagan folklore. The church had its own water fears. Take the ordeal by water. You're accused of a crime. There's no evidence. So the judge decides to let God figure it out. You're tied up and thrown into a river. If you float, you're guilty because the water rejects you. If you sink, innocent. Congratulations. You now have 2 minutes before your lungs decide to become relics. This was mostly used on women, especially those accused of witchcraft. Because if she floats, she's a witch. Burn her. If she sinks, she's a good Christian woman. Bury her. Medieval justice was not big on win-win scenarios. And then there were the blessed springs. All across Europe, priests and monks would bless local springs. Sometimes sincerely. Sometimes just to stop the locals from calling it the place where the forest fairies drown liars. These blessings often involved chanting holy water and relics, usually a bone, tooth, or finger of a saint. Once a spring was blessed, it became a pilgrimage site. People would flock there to bathe their children, collect water for the sick, or just stare into the ripples and hope their soul felt slightly less terrible. Some springs were said to speak. Literally. There are accounts, admittedly secondhand and probably wine-fueled, of people hearing voices from the water. Prophecies, warnings, comforting murmurs, or, occasionally, just eerie laughter that sent entire villages into a panic and forced a priest to stand in the mud with a crucifix, yelling, "Stop haunting the sheep trough." It worked. Probably. And all of this, the curses, the spirits, the rituals, only added fuel to the water wars. Because if a well was holy, you didn't just need it for drinking. You needed it to protect your family, to heal your wounds, to keep your pig from turning inside out during Lent. Control the water, and you didn't just control farming. You controlled fear. You told your neighbors, you can't touch that spring. The lady lives there. And if they didn't believe you, you waited until they got sick and said, "See." Wells became symbols of power, of purity, of danger. Villages made rules about who could approach them. Women on their period? Forbidden. People with unbaptized children? Forbidden. Men who once insulted the local bishop's dog? You guessed it, forbidden. Water was both medicine and minefield. So you wake up. The fog still lingers. The cursed well still stands at the edge of the woods, covered in moss and bad intentions. You think about drawing water from it. But instead, you go to the communal trough, nod politely at the mule, and whisper a small prayer to Saint Dymphna that the morning stew won't kill you. Because in the medieval world, the most dangerous thing wasn't a sword or plague. It was a bucket with opinions. You wake up. Again. Because you apparently live in an endless cycle of damp wool and futile anxiety. This time, you're in a city. A walled medieval town. It smells like old fish, wet stone, and something vaguely cabbage adjacent. The kind of town where everyone pretends to be important, but no one owns pants without holes in them. There are no faucets. No plumbing. Not unless you're a monk, a lord, or someone with blackmail material on the bishop. Water has to be fetched, hauled, carried, by hand or by donkey, or, if you're unlucky, by you, because your little brother twisted his ankle pretending to be a jousting frog, and now your family chores double. In the middle of the town is the communal well. Big, round, covered by a wooden roof to keep out dead birds and nosy goats. And it's surrounded by people shouting, bickering, throwing elbows, and accusing each other of cue cutting, which in this era is basically a minor felony. It is 7 a.m. You have not eaten, and your day has already started with a fight over who put whose bucket in line first. Welcome to urban water management, medieval style. Let's talk about medieval cities. Most European towns had central wells, often multiple, if the town was rich enough or old enough to have expanded over a few centuries. But the water supply was still deeply limited. One well could serve hundreds of people. And if it dried up or got contaminated, that's it. No water, no life, no Netflix. And contamination was common. Because let's remember, medieval cities had garbage. Not the oops, forgot to take the recycling out kind. The someone dumped a dead goat in the alley again kind. People emptied chamber pots into the streets. Pigs wandered freely. Butchers washed blood into storm drains that led, you guessed it, straight into local water sources. If you're wondering whether any part of this process involved filtration or sanitation, I regret to inform you that absolutely not. You drank whatever came up from the well, and you were grateful it wasn't chunky. Now, if you lived in a nice part of town, which meant you paid taxes, were related to someone with a title, or at least didn't smell like a vinegar barrel, you might have access to a private well or even a cistern. Some cities had underground aqueducts. Others had elaborate water towers, like in medieval Bologna or London, which used lead pipes to move water around the city. Because, of course, they used lead. Nothing screams long-term planning like piping your drinking water through toxic metal. If you were rich, you could even have someone deliver your water. Imagine that, a medieval Uber Eats, but for hydration. A munch shows up with a barrel and a bad attitude. You give him a few coins. He gives you slightly less dirty water than the peasants drink. But the real water drama? That happened during a siege. Let's set the scene. You live in a walled castle or fortified town. Life is already exhausting. You sleep on straw, bathe once a month, maybe, and the bread has more rocks than flour. Then, one day, someone shows up outside your city with 100 archers, 50 siege towers, and an enthusiastic hatred for your local lord. You're under siege. Food? Limited. Morale? Questionable. But the biggest problem isn't arrows or fire. It's water. Because you can ration grain. You can stretch out salted pork. But water? You can't just invent more of it. You either have access, or you don't. And medieval attackers knew this. One of the first things they did during a siege was cut off the water supply, block the aqueduct, poison the river. Or, if you were unlucky enough to have your well outside the city walls, which somehow happened more often than you'd think, just park a few nights there and dare you to come get a drink. In 1191, during the Siege of Acre in the Crusades, the besieging armies didn't just cut off the water. They redirected streams to create muddy traps around the city, making it harder for defenders to get out and for reinforcements to get in. Thousands died, mostly of thirst, or dysentery, or because someone gave up and drank from a latrine pit. In other sieges, defenders tried to fake having water. They'd pour water down the walls to pretend they were wasting it, hoping to demoralize attackers, or set up decoy barrels, or even let livestock wander around looking plump and hydrated, a medieval flex to say, "Come at us, bro. We have hydrated goats." Meanwhile, inside the city, it's panic time. Wells run dry. People fight over puddles. The local baker starts charging triple for barley water with a mysterious green tint. Mothers boil the same pot of water 6 times. Soldiers hoard barrels. And inevitably, someone, probably named Jeff, tries to sell holy dew collected from the castle roof at 2 silver pieces per cup. There are records of towns under siege where people began digging emergency wells, trying to tap underground springs while arrows rained down. It rarely worked. And even when it did, the water might come up tainted with blood, mud, or battlefield runoff. But what choice did they have? You either drank it or died. Water wasn't just about survival. It was about loyalty. In times of crisis, lords used water access to control their people. Stay loyal, and you can drink. Refuse to pay taxes? No water. Anger the bishop? No water. Accused of heresy? Say hello to no water and some light torture. In castle life, water access was a matter of military strategy. Many castles had wells dug into the bedrock, deep inside the keep, protected, hidden, sometimes even guarded at all times. Others had secret tunnels to springs or cisterns. If your enemies found and blocked it, the entire castle could fall. In the 13th century siege of Château Gallard in Normandy, the attackers discovered a secret latrine tunnel, which, yes, doubled as a water access point, and used it to sneak into the fortress. Let that sink in. A castle fell through the toilet. Now that's resource management. Back in the towns, water control extended to public fountains. In Italian city-states like Florence, Siena, or Rome, elaborate fountains were built not just for aesthetics, but as symbols. You didn't just drink there. You witnessed the power of the ruling class. Look, they said, we have running water. Behold, peasants. We are civilized. Never mind that the fountain water ran through lead pipes and probably contained half a dead lizard. It was prestige. You could tell who ruled a town by who controlled the spigot. In some cities, guilds managed water access. In others, it was the church. And if 2 rival factions controlled different parts of town, guess what they fought over? That's right, the communal wash basin. Dozens of mini-civil wars broke out over who got to fill barrels first, who drained the fountain dry, who spit in the bathhouse cistern as a political statement. Water wasn't neutral. It was a battleground, a symbol, a slow-burning fuse. So you wake up. Again. This time, the town is quiet. Too quiet. You step outside, bucket in hand. The well is closed. A plank nailed across it. A crude sign scrawled in charcoal. Water for taxpayers only. You sigh, turn back, and begin your walk to the nearby stream, 2 miles outside the city. Past the bandits, past the wolves, past the haunted tree that whispers your name. Because in the medieval world, staying hydrated wasn't just a matter of thirst. It was a matter of survival, loyalty, and really petty politics. If you've made it this far, through the trench-footed trenches of siege life, the drama of city fountains, and the emotional betrayal of Jeff the Holy Dew vendor, congratulations. You're now ready to expand your horizon, or at least your hydration options. Because in this chapter, we're not just staying in your damp, suspiciously cabbage-scented village. We're traveling across medieval regions to ask a noble, time-honored question. What happens when you don't have enough water, have too much water, or can't convince your neighbors to stop pooping in the only river? In other words, how did different regions deal with water access, and how did it go terribly, terribly wrong? So sit back, settle in, drape a fur cloak over your shoulders if you must. We're about to meander through the deserts of Al-Andalus, the frosty fjords of Norway, and the marshes of Anglo-Saxon sadness, where every drop of clean water was a miracle, and every attempt at plumbing was a bold experiment in disappointment. You wake up in southern Spain. The sun is already making your eyelids sweat. You are hot, dry, dusty. Your mouth feels like the inside of a flour bag, and your blanket tastes like sunburn and regret. Welcome to medieval Al-Andalus, where water was both a precious resource and a massive architectural obsession. This is where you'll find some of the most advanced medieval water systems in all of Europe, because it had to be. When you live in a dry region, you don't just hope for rain. You build for it. Enter the cannet. Yes, I know it sounds like a medieval insult, you absolute cannet. But it's actually a brilliant system. Originally from Persia and used widely in Islamic Spain, a cannet was a long, sloping underground tunnel that channeled water from an aquifer deep beneath the mountains into cities and farms. It's like an ancient water slide, but in reverse. And more engineering. And less fun. Al-Andalus was full of them. They dug tunnels through stone, built reservoirs called aljibes, and lined everything with clever tiling to reduce evaporation. And these weren't just peasant puddles, these were luxury hydration routes. Palaces like the Alhambra in Granada had entire aesthetic water features, fountains, pools, trickling streams running through courtyards, all part of the cultural reverence for water as both sacred and soothing. You sip from a carved basin while doves coo in the distance. It's tranquil. It's clean. It's not giving you cholera. For once, water isn't terrifying. But you're not staying here. No, we're heading north. You wake up in Norway. Your teeth hurt. From a cold. Your knees also hurt. From a cold. Your hair hurts. Probably from the wind whipping frozen rain into your skull for the 6th hour in a row. Here in the Norse countryside, the problem isn't scarcity. It's excess. Water, everywhere, and most of it is inconveniently vertical. You've got rivers, fjords, lakes, snow, ice, and occasionally your roof collapsing under the weight of sleet. The streams are fast, steep, and loud. They roar like gods on a caffeine bender. And because medieval Norwegians had neither concrete nor chill, they just kind of worked around it. If you needed water, you found a stream. If you needed to store it, you built a barrel. If you needed to cross it, you waited, or prayed. It's not that they didn't try. Some Viking Age towns had wooden pipes, bored out logs, lashed together and angled downhill. Others used open channels carved into stone or timber troughs. But in general, Norse water management was less organized infrastructure and more controlled chaos. Rainwater, collected in cisterns. River water, hauled in buckets. Ice, chipped off and melted. It worked. Kind of. Unless you slipped, fell into a fjord, and got claimed by a sea spirit. The Norse also had a particular relationship with bathing, which was surprisingly frequent, once a week, more or less, and enough to make the rest of medieval Europe deeply suspicious. You wake up in a steam bath. The birch branches sting your thighs, but your soul is clean. The water is scalding, the fire crackles, and no one's caught dysentery in 3 days. Not bad. Now we head to England, land of fog, mud, and poor water decisions. You wake up in an Anglo-Saxon hamlet. Everything is soggy. You didn't know moss could grow on your boots while you're wearing them. The water here is not scarce. It's just gross. The village is built next to a slow-moving stream. It's brown, thick, possibly self-aware. The livestock drink from it. The laundry gets washed in it. Sometimes, people go to the bathroom near it. There's a clean side and a dirty side, but let's be honest, both sides are sketchy at best. There is no plumbing, no waterworks, just community rules and bad luck. Your main water source is either a well, hopefully not full of frogs, a spring, hopefully not claimed by angry fairies, or a barrel of collected rainwater that your aunt insists is fresher when it sits for a few days. You boil it when you can. You pray when you can't. And if you're lucky, someone nearby knows how to dig a filtering trench, essentially a sandpit that acts as a rudimentary purifier. It helps. Unless it doesn't. Monasteries, though, were different. You wake up in a monastery in Northumbria. Everything is silent, except for the sound of monks chanting and water flowing, through a system of lead-line pipes built by hand, maintained by generations of monastic engineers who had nothing else to do except pray and invent indoor plumbing. Yes, monasteries had running water. They had bathhouses, cloister fountains, cisterns, underground tunnels, and probably one guy named Brother Cedric who got electrocuted by lightning while trying to improve the aqueduct with copper wire. Meanwhile, outside the monastery walls, your cousins are drinking out of a ditch. Let's take a moment to appreciate the marsh towns. Places like the fens in eastern England or the swamps of central France had complicated relationships with water. Too much water. Not enough usable water. And definitely nowhere dry to sit. You wake up on a raised wooden plank, your feet dangling over what can only be described as medieval soup. Frogs croak. Mosquitoes buzz. And someone nearby mutters that the marsh god took another cow last night. These communities survived by building up houses on stilts, roads on elevated walkways, and drinking water collected from small springs or imported by boat. Yes, boat. Because when everything is wet, your well becomes a floating latrine faster than you can say malaria isn't real yet. Still, people adapted. They dug drainage ditches to keep floodwaters at bay. Some areas had turf walls, embankments made of earth and woven brush that could hold back water in rainy seasons. They created water meadows, fish ponds, and clever sluices to manage irrigation. It worked until it didn't. The marsh flooded. The roads washed out. And suddenly, you're drinking mushroom soup, whether you like it or not. Finally, let's visit the mountains. You wake up in the Alps. Your nose is cold. Your fingers are cold. Your soul is cold. The water here is clean, crystal clear, glacial, freezing, delicious, and trying to kill you at every turn. It comes from snowmelt, trickling down steep slopes into narrow channels called bisses in Switzerland or rigoles in southern France. These were hand-carved irrigation streams, maintained by generations of semi-frozen shepherds who spent more time arguing with rocks than talking to other humans. These systems were marvels of communal engineering. People built rotating schedules. Everyone got water on different days. Your family might get Thursday afternoons. Your neighbor gets Friday mornings. It's like a shared Netflix password, but instead of watching crime documentaries, you're watering barley and trying not to fall off a cliff. Break the rules? Steal more than your share? You could be fined, banned, or in some cases, put on trial. Yes, trial. For stealing water. One guy in 1293 was whipped for blocking the channel with rocks, so his field got more flow. It was a brutal, mountainous, democratic chaos. But hey, at least the water was clean. So what's the takeaway? Whether you lived in a desert, a swamp, a castle, or a glacier-covered goat hut, medieval people went to incredible lengths to get water, and fought just as hard to control it. Water wasn't just hydration. It was identity, infrastructure, politics, faith, and the underlying reason your cousin still has that weird eye twitch from the village well worm incident of '83. And as we drift further into this absurd, soggy slumber, remember, no matter where you were in the medieval world, the only constant was that someone, somewhere, was definitely drinking out of the wrong side of the bucket. You've trudged through muddy Anglo-Saxon brooks, dodged Byzantine chamber pots, and even survived Norwegian bathhouses without slipping into hypothermia. And now? Now you wake up next to a puddle. It's not just any puddle. It's a sacred puddle. A miraculous puddle. A puddle that, according to the 3 barefoot pilgrims kneeling beside you, cured a man's gout, banished demons, and helped a goose return from the dead. The goose part might be metaphorical. No one knows. Because welcome to the bizarre, fascinating, utterly unregulated world of holy wells and miracle springs, where medieval faith, folklore, and mild dehydration all collided into a bubbling mess of devotion, economics, and contagious optimism. Take a deep breath. Smell that? It's moss, incense, and the faint whiff of questionable theology. Let's dive in. You wake up in the English countryside. It's misty. It's damp. You've lost feeling in one foot, and your blanket smells like radishes and disappointment. But the mood is electric. Because today is the feast of St. Gwendolyn of the Wet Sock, and the village has gathered around her holy well, a murky stone pit, that allegedly sprang forth the day she miraculously stubbed her toe on a Roman sandal and saw a vision of a weeping trout. The water is said to heal skin diseases, soothe arthritis, and cure unfaithful husbands, though that last one usually involved drowning them. And this is not a one-off thing. Across medieval Europe, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of sacred springs and holy wells. Some had clear water. Some were fizzy. Some smelled like sulfur. One bubbled mysteriously, possibly due to trapped gas, divine energy, or the corpse of a small sheik. But they all had 2 things in common. A backstory that sounded like a drunken game of medieval telephone. A reputation that made pilgrims flock to them like moths to a damp, healing flame. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of historical weirdness. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Seriously, it's bizarrely fascinating seeing people listening to this from Iceland at 3 a.m. or from Brazil while eating cereal. Right, back to the divine puddles. Let's start with St. Winifred's Well, in Wales, one of the most famous healing wells in medieval Britain. Legend has it, Winifred was a beautiful young woman who wanted to become a nun. A local nobleman, Caradog, did not like that idea. He proposed to her. She said no. He beheaded her. Because, you know, medieval chivalry. Where her head fell, a spring burst forth, crystal clear, bubbling, and apparently ready to absolve all sins and skin conditions. Winifred, by the way, was resurrected by her uncle, Saint Bruno, who reattached her head with some light prayer and possibly a stick of butter. No one asked too many questions. That spring became a major pilgrimage site. People walked barefoot for miles just to bathe in the water. They threw coins into it, lit candles by it, and even slept beside it hoping to dream of saints. Some were healed. Others caught pneumonia. Either way, it was a vibe. And this wasn't unique. France had Lourdes. Ireland had the well of St. Brigid, who once turned bathwater into beer. Italy had wells blessed by bishops. Germany had holy springs guarded by terrifying stone statues of angels holding buckets like they were ready to pour judgment. What started as pagan water cults, worshipping rivers, springs, and lakes, was slowly absorbed into Christian tradition. You couldn't wipe out people's love for a good, mysterious pool of water. So instead of banning it, the church just said, "Fine. It's Jesus now." You wake up under a tree. A long line of peasants snakes past you. Some carry jugs. Others carry children. One guy is holding a chicken with intense spiritual hope. They've come for the water. And not just for healing. Some people used holy wells to test honesty. In parts of England, you could dunk an accused thief's hand into a holy spring. If it didn't get infected within 3 days, they were innocent. If it did, guilt. Or strep. Either way, judgment delivered by bacteria. Other wells were known for giving signs. You drop in a pin and watch how it landed. Bubbled? Good luck. Sank fast? You're probably going to step in something unpleasant today. Some people read the ripples like tea leaves. Others just stood there until they felt less anxious. You didn't need science. You needed faith, patience, and a sturdy immune system. But of course, wherever there's faith, there's also commerce. By the 13th century, holy wells weren't just spiritual. They were economic engines. Entire towns grew around them. Inns, taverns, trinket vendors. People sold relics, badges, dried moss allegedly kissed by saints. One guy in Canterbury reportedly sold holy water by the teaspoon, for half a penny, probably the medieval equivalent of buying Gwyneth Paltrow's bathwater. The church started building shrines around the most profitable wells. Priests gave sermons. Monks managed the flow of pilgrims and water. Donations were collected. Some wells had their own clergy. And of course, the miracle books. These were handwritten logs of documented healings. Blind girl sees again. Mun with scabies now itch-free. Farmer cured of donkey-related trauma. Was it true? Maybe. Was it good PR? Absolutely. Miracles brought pilgrims. Pilgrims brought money. Money kept the roof from leaking. Some skeptics, of course, raised concerns. Like, why does this particular spring only cure people during the festival? Why does the water taste suspiciously of vinegar? Why does Brother Hugo keep getting healed every year, despite being perfectly healthy? But those were the quiet grumblers. The true believers were loud, devoted, and very, very thirsty. Now let's talk about the dark side of sacred wells. Because for every sweet healing spring, there were at least 3 spooky, cursed, or just plain unsettling ones. You wake up in Ireland, next to a black pool called Tobar na Hama, or the Well of Souls. It's said that the water whispers your name if death is near. No one drinks from it, except Kevin. Kevin went missing last spring. We don't talk about Kevin. Some wells were thought to house spirits, fairies, or angry ghosts. You had to leave offerings, coins, bits of cloth, even bits of hair. Skip the ritual, and you might get warts, madness, or a visit from a headless horsewoman named Grain. In Cornwall, a well called Madron's well was believed to predict fertility. Couples would visit, throw in pins, and pray for babies. Others just used it to find out if their partner was cheating. One suspicious splash equals 2 weeks of passive-aggressive goat milking. And then there were the wishing wells. Yes, they existed. You toss in a coin. You make a wish. And then you wait. Sometimes for years. Sometimes forever. Most people wished for good health, a strong harvest, or an end to the local bear problem. Very few wished for clean plumbing. Go figure. Eventually, the Reformation rolled in, and things changed. You wake up in 1539. Your sacred well has been filled in with rocks by an angry Protestant who says it promotes papist superstition and frog worship. You argue. He threatens to dunk your head. You leave. Suddenly, thousands of these wells were destroyed, defaced, or simply left to dry. The Church of England, Lutheran reformers, and others saw these sites as dangerously close to idolatry, worshipping water instead of God. To be fair, some people had turned the wells into full-on tourist traps. There were scandals, fake miracles, priests caught charging double during Lent. One friar was exposed for bottling regular river water and selling it as saintly tears of the Blessed Infant. So the crackdown came fast. Wells were shut, pilgrimages banned, saints unsainted, and the era of holy hydration slowly evaporated. But not entirely. Some wells survived, quietly maintained by locals, still visited on feast days, still whispered about in corners of villages. Others were rediscovered in the 19th century by folklore fans and Victorian eccentrics. A few are still active today. And you know what? They're still kind of magical. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, drifting gently toward the blessed slumber of the sacred spring, remember, water wasn't just for washing. It was for believing. Whether it came from a holy well, a healing stream, or a bubbling mud puddle with a suspicious smell and 3 coins in it, medieval people saw water not just as a survival tool, but as a sacred bridge between this world and something better, something cleaner, something divine, something that didn't give you dysentery. Probably. And that hope? That faith in a better drop of water? That might be the most human thing of all. Because here's a little-known fact no one warned you about in school. By the late medieval period, water wasn't just a matter of divine springs, moody rivers, or whether your neighbor's pig had drowned in the village pond. It had become politics. Yes, real, exhausting, bureaucratic politics. With scrolls. With stamps. With middle-aged men arguing over whose turn it was to clean the town conduit. Because you, dear listener, are now waking up not in a monastery or a farmstead or a sacred grotto, but in a medieval city. Somewhere in England, France, or maybe the Low Countries. You open your eyes. You're on a wooden bench. The air smells like ale, smoke, and passive-aggressive civic responsibility. and someone is shouting about water fees. Welcome to the glamorous world of municipal water management, circa 1350. Try to stay awake. Or don't. This chapter's perfect for drifting off, while simultaneously learning how much the human race can overthink hydration. You blink slowly and realize you're sitting in a dimly lit guild hall. It's the weekly meeting of the city council. There are about a dozen people here, the mayor, some merchants, a baker who hasn't slept since Lent, and you, the new water officer, because you lost a bet. This is what passes for governance in the later Middle Ages. Unlike the countryside, where people either found a spring or died trying, cities needed actual systems. Because medieval cities were dense, smelly, full of humans who wanted water not just for drinking, but for cooking, tanning leather, brewing beer, putting out fires, and occasionally dumping in buckets of rotting fish heads. Left unmanaged, things went bad. Fast. So by the 13th century, urban areas across Europe began creating public water systems. And boy, were they both impressive and full of the kind of drama you'd expect from people who didn't have Netflix. Let's start with the conduits. In London, Paris, and dozens of other cities, public money, meaning taxes and merchant donations, was used to build stone channels from Cleanish springs outside the city walls. These channels ran for miles, sometimes underground, sometimes in wooden pipes, sometimes across massive aqueducts built by people with far more hope than structural knowledge. These conduits emptied into public fountains or tanks, sometimes called cisterns or bosses, which were placed in market squares and at major crossroads. Think of them as early medieval water coolers, where people gathered, gossiped, filled jugs, and occasionally tried to baptize unwilling chickens. But here's the kicker: everyone thought someone else should be the one to clean them. So before you lean back too far into your blanket, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if this kind of sleepy, sarcastic deep dive into history is your thing. And drop a comment about where you're listening from. It still baffles me that people are falling asleep to 14th century plumbing politics in bed, in their car, or while folding laundry in Norway. But hey, welcome. Right. Back to the conduit drama. Let's say you live in Paris, circa 1375. You're a baker. You use a lot of water, for dough, for cleaning, and for trying to keep rats from declaring your cellar a sovereign kingdom. You want access to the Fontaine de Innocence, a public water source built atop a Roman spring. But you're not allowed to just stroll up and take what you want. No. You need a water token, a little wooden chip given out by city officials, entitling the bearer to fill up to X number of buckets per day. Lose your token? You're out of luck. Find someone else's token? Congratulations, you now own 12 angry gallons and the right to be publicly scolded by the water bailiff. In London, it got even more dramatic. The Great Conduit of London was built in the 13th century to bring spring water from Tyburn, now near Hyde Park, all the way to Cheapside. The pipe system was maintained by the city government, which employed conduit keepers, men tasked with guarding the cisterns from thieves, misusers, and people who thought washing their pig in the fountain was fine because the water looks free, doesn't it? Spoiler, it was not free. There were fines. Lots of fines. Dumping waste in the conduit? That's 2 shillings. Filling more than your daily allowance? 1 shilling. Letting your donkey drink from the tank? That's a day in the stocks and public ridicule from local schoolboys who throw cabbages. One actual case from 1412 involved a fishmonger who tried to block off a conduit pipe and redirect the water into his basement, effectively stealing the city's public supply so he could keep his eels fresher. He was fined, humiliated, and then probably celebrated in private, because that level of petty water crime is honestly impressive. Now you might be thinking, surely, people just dug wells if they didn't want to use the public fountains? Well, yes. But it wasn't that simple. Urban wells existed, lots of them. Private homes had their own. Monasteries and guild halls had better ones. But private wells required deep digging, constant maintenance, and a high tolerance for rats, bones, and whatever mystery juice was dripping in from your neighbor's latrine pit. Also, not all groundwater was safe. In densely packed cities, well water had a habit of getting infected. Feces, blood, tannery runoff. If it could seep, it seeped. So the city's water council, yes, that was a thing, had to regularly test wells, mark unsafe ones, and occasionally order that they be filled in. People who disobeyed? Fined. Or drowned. Sometimes both. which led to an awkward social situation. Public water was gross because everyone used it, but private wells were riskier unless you had land, money, and a working knowledge of hydrology. So most people did what humans do best. They boiled everything and hoped for the best. Or drank beer. Lots and lots of beer. Speaking of which, let's talk about breweries. In medieval towns, brewing was a water-intensive process, and beer was safer to drink than untreated water. But brewers weren't exactly known for their environmental sensitivity. Many dumped their hot, spent mash water back into the city ditches. This led to algae blooms, foul smells, and the kind of frothy swamp puddles that caused religious doubt. To combat this, cities began issuing brewery water ordinances. These rules, written in Latin, French, or bad handwriting, tried to limit who could brew, when they could draw water, and how they disposed of it. Spoiler, they were mostly ignored. In some towns, breweries actually funded local water projects just to shut people up about their pollution. In Bruges, one famous brewer sponsored a new conduit system and was later given a seat on the Water Council, possibly as both an honor and a subtle threat. Nice pipes you've got here, Willem. Be a shame if someone poured barley sludge into them. Of course, we can't forget the bathhouses. Late medieval cities were full of them, places where water wasn't just for drinking, but for soaking, gossiping, and awkward communal nudity. Many bathhouses had their own wells or were linked to the public supply, and disputes over bathhouse water usage were frequent. Too much hot water drawn at once could lower pressure for nearby homes. One town in Bohemia had an ordinance stating that bathhouse owners could only heat water after sunset to avoid daytime shortages. Did people obey? Not really, but it made the city feel like it was doing something. And then there were the fire brigades. Not professional firefighters. Mind you, more like sweaty volunteers with leather buckets trying not to trip over cobblestones. City councils had to ensure water was stockpiled in barrels or cisterns throughout the city for use during fires. Conduit keepers were also tasked with alerting the public and, if needed, smashing open cistern heads to release more water. This sounds brave. It usually wasn't. The water pressure was laughable, the buckets leaked, and everyone got distracted when the alehouse caught fire. By the 15th century, municipal water governance had become a full-time job in most large cities. Some towns even had water court to resolve disputes. Imagine Judge Judy, but in a hooded cloak and with a gavel made from petrified wood. Common cases included: he diverted my gutter stream. She filled her jugs before the bell rang. There duck bathes in the public tank. And occasionally, my neighbor's daughter is a witch and poisoned the well. That one usually ended poorly. So as you sink deeper into your pillow, lulled by the soothing sound of distant water dribbling from a 14th century spout, remember this. By the end of the medieval period, water had gone from a divine gift to a municipal headache. Cities fought not just for access, but for control, for laws, for the right to fine you 3 pence for letting your dog swim in the cistern. And despite the mess, the leaks, the stink, and the ceaseless arguments, it worked. Water kept cities alive. Barely. Grumpily. Sometimes slime-covered. But alive. And now, so are you.